Yesterday, class, we began discussing the Enlightenment, a time period in which really intelligent men got together and began thinking about how they could improve society. There are several big philosophers that South Carolina wants you to know that were Enlightenment era philosophers. Today, we're going to talk about probably the two most famous uh, men named Locke and Rousseau. John Locke is one of the most important of the Enlightenment era philosophers. John Locke is going to come up with a lot of big ideas on how to improve government systems and get people away from the idea of an absolute government. He's one of the main guys who came up with the idea of the social contract, which we talked about yesterday, in which government and the people come together and they agree to help each other out. He's also going to believe in a concept called the state of law, the state of nature, the natural law. Basically, this means that there are natural rights that everybody's given. Um, Basically, God-given rights that we all have and that government can't take. And this flies directly in the face of what absolute governments taught, which basically said that your laws, your rights come from the king, and that's all that matters. And if you had a problem with the laws and the rights, then you had a problem with the king, and the king would have you put to death. But Locke taught we had natural rights. The other big philosopher we're going to talk about today is a French philosopher named Jean-Jacques Rousseau. John Locke was from the British Isles, but Jean-Jacques Rousseau is a French man who also began looking at the absolute government issue from a very different place with a very different frame of mind than John Locke's. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in addition to being a philosopher, was also a writer and a musician. So in a lot of ways, he's almost like a Renaissance man, which we talk about in 6th grade. He's good at a lot of different things, and because of this, a lot of people still pay attention to Jean-Jacques Rousseau. The goal in today is going to be to look at these two guys and figure out which one has the biggest impact on our lives. And it's going to be a kind of a difficult choice. If you look at it from government, you may think one guy. If you look at it from just all around, you may look at it being the other guy. But these guys are going to be very different with very different beliefs. We're going to look at their basic beliefs. And as soon as you look at your basic beliefs, hopefully you'll see a major difference. John Locke, once again, believed that all people had natural rights. That from the moment you're born, God's given you certain rights, and that the king or the monarch should not have any say over those rights. Once again, this flies directly in the face of the idea of an absolute monarchy, which says your rights come from your government. And if your government decides to get rid of those rights for a while, then the government can do that. He would have been a big promoter of the concept of free speech, which we like to think of as an American principle, but as we'll see today and on Monday, lots of other cultures had this concept of free speech. Meanwhile, Rousseau believes society, or the people around us, culture, corrupts us. In other words, society and the people around us make us bad. It makes us do bad things. And government's job is to save us from society. I have a picture here of a comic book. In case you haven't figured out this year, I'm really big into the comic books. In this comic book, Superman decides to run for president. He becomes president. And a lot of people kind of want a government like that. Superman can do pretty much anything. You know, he can fly, he's super strong, he's super fast, he's got laser beam vision. He can do pretty much anything, and a lot of people want a government that does anything for them. Just this week, there was a woman who went to a Mitt Romney thing because the election's coming up, and she was talking about how she hates Mitt Romney, and she's going to vote for Barack Obama because supposedly Obama gave her a free cell phone. People want government to do everything for us. Now, obviously, the Obama administration says, no, we've not given this woman a cell phone, and that she's a little crazy. Pay her no attention. But that's the mindset a lot of Americans have right now for government, is they want a government that takes care of absolutely every problem in their lives. A super president. Yesterday, we talked about the idea of the social contract. Once again, Locke is one of the first big guys to promote this idea that government's supposed to be an agreement between the people and the government. Got a picture here of a contract because I want y'all to remember, really important, that a contract's just basically an agreement between two groups. The first words of our United States Constitution are "We the people of the United States." Once again, it's an agreement between us and the government. We have to kind of abide by this agreement. Locke taught that the social contract was an agreement between the people and the government, and government's number one job was to protect our rights, to make sure we all got the same rights, to make sure we were all treated fairly by the law, not to infringe, which is a fancy word for take away our rights. A lot of countries, the kings take away those natural rights that Locke was trying to promote. Locke wants everybody to know that government's job is to keep our natural rights safe, to keep our God-given rights safe. Now, this slide is the one that really introduces a major wrinkle, and it's a really important concept for everybody to understand, so please make sure you really pay attention to this concept. John Locke supported the idea that if government ever stopped fulfilling its obligations, then people had the right to create a new government. If government stopped preserving our rights, if government started trying to take our rights, then people had a right and actually need to cast away those governments that were doing those bad things, to put it away. In America today, if you have a problem with the government, that you vote for the other guy, and you hope he gets elected. But even on a more basic level, if by chance that stops working or something like that, then John Locke says people have an obligation and a right to start a totally new government. When you look back at the American Revolution, the Americans said, hey, the British guys are mistreating us, they're taking away our rights. And so the Americans quoted this concept. They talked about how there comes a moment when you have to put off the old government and take on a new one. That's taking this idea of Locke's view of government to its natural conclusion. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, our French philosopher, however, had a very different idea on government and what government's main job was. Locke said government was to preserve our rights. Rousseau says government's main job was to create laws that benefit the most people, or the majority of the people. Yesterday I told you that all of these philosophers agreed that absolute government was a problem, and it just became how to fix the problem that they were looking at. Jean-Jacques Rousseau said the way to solve absolute government is to make government look out for the majority of the people. This idea is democracy. And a lot of people think democracy is a great idea, and it has some great points to it, definitely. A lot of people believe we're a democracy, and we're going to talk a little bit about on the next page why we're not a democracy, although we're becoming more and more like one in a lot of ways. And if you look at this picture, you see the scales, and there's a group of three guys, and then there's a group of one guy, and the group of one guy obviously lost in weighing down the scales. That's going to be a problem, and we'll talk about why on the next page. Now, when looking at two different things, it's always a good idea to kind of compare and contrast, to look at how they're similar and how they're different. The main similarity between these two guys is the fact that they both believed in a limited government. They both believed that absolute governments were a bad idea and they would cause problems. They both believed that people needed to have rights. Their works, the things they wrote, the things they said, influenced the idea of popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty means the people are in charge. The government gets its power from the people, not from some great government gift store or something. This idea of popular sovereignty is very important to American history, and it's going to be used from different sides in lots of different situations, but the idea that people are in charge of government. So how do these two guys affect American government? These Enlightenment philosophers affect our government today. John Locke is a major influence on American government. If you look at our Constitution, if you look at the Declaration of Independence, you actually read what those two documents say, you'll see word for word almost what John Locke said and what John Locke taught. Absolutely essential to understanding our government. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, however, nowhere near as important to the development of American government. Jean-Jacques Rousseau's idea that democracy is so essential to a limited government was almost the exact opposite of how the American founding fathers felt. They worried about creating a majority tyranny, or in other words, a majority that had too much power and would take advantage of the poor or the smaller classes, the minority classes. I've got a poster here that says democracy, majority rules, right? And it's two lions or a couple of lions chowing down on an animal. And majority works for the lions because they attack in packs, but it's not so great if you're the animal they're attacking. And that's the problem with democracy. It seems great, but all too often the majority rules at the expense or by hurting the minority or the smaller groups.